We're going on a bit of a journey today. I'm Andrew Pierce. I'm CEO and head therapist at Blueprint Therapy Solutions in Woodbury, Minnesota. Hope you brought your coffee. About 3/4 of the time will be spent exploring up to the second science on the nature of reality itself. The last quarter will be clinical application of these new insights. Mankind's understanding of the universe has over time been shaped by our limited perceptual capacity. Our understanding of the world has evolved from caveman times through the Middle Ages to modern times as technology has shaped our worldview with more and more powerful telescopes, microscopes, and other apparatus facilitating the evolution of our thought and understanding. Ours is the first generation that has been able to explore down to the very fabric of reality itself, allowing us to gain a level of understanding that has totally reset our conception of how things work. These new insights have very real and practical implications and applications for patients in the psychology field and to ourselves. In many ways, this is an experiential intervention, as you'll see by the end of the presentation. Over the years, as I attended AA meetings, I intuitively developed the belief that those with any sense of spiritual devoutness seem to have an easier time of establishing and maintaining long-term recovery than those with atheistic or agnostic perspectives. As a clinician, I thought it might be useful to try and hack into whatever was behind this phenomenon so that my patients might derive the clinical benefits of spirituality. I approached it from the angle of placebo effect. After all, I thought placebo effect can account for as much as 75% efficacy versus a control group in medical studies. And I'm not trying to fix anyone's physiological symptoms, I'm just trying to help them change their mind a bit. One thing that's true is that those who tend to be analytical are the least suggestible when it comes to adoption of a spiritual perspective. Analytical people, however, do respect credible facts. Thankfully, the facts surrounding the most successful model of nature of reality, which is what physics is, the study of nature of reality, those facts have significant implications that leave little room for doubt as to the existence of some sort of intelligence. Over the last 7 years, I've formalized and implemented with many patients in varied settings, ranging from residential treatment to IOP to individual therapy and workshops, a clinical model aimed at resolving spiritual skepticism, accelerating both the rate and depth of patients' recovery to a remarkable effect. My preferred modality in the past has always been REBT, Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, because I believe that patients will have more buy-in if they have a rational understanding of their pathology, the approach we're taking, and why we're taking it. QBERT simply adds the quantum aspect to the mix, and I switch around the REBT because QREBT doesn't sound quite as slick. The behavioral element of the QBERT element of QBERT involves intensive meditative rehearsal or mindfulness, which is an evidence-based process, with intensive emotional visualization, the purpose for all of which is to be revealed as we progress through the presentation. Nonetheless, the three facets of QBERT involve the foundationally science. Quantum physics provides an irrefutable scientific basis of reality upon which to build. Then, philosophically speaking, we have to logically extrapolate relevant implications of the science for clinical application. And then finally, as a clinician, we apply conclusions to the patient's clinical pathology. Let's take a 30,000-foot generic overview of the change model and how it works. The Dispenza change model is pretty useful in this applying this change theory. For the average person, 95% of the thoughts that they have today are the same thoughts they had yesterday. They show up to our office with everything they know about their past, their experiences, their unquestioned beliefs about who they are, about their limitations, past failed efforts to change, conditioning from their dysfunctional family of origin, and beliefs about the world. Those thoughts have perpetuated the same choices, yielding the same behaviors, experiences, and emotions, which then reinform their thoughts, and the circle repeats itself until they realize that the status quo is unsustainable. That's when they reach out to us. We then provide new information, recovery content, literature, videos, TED Talks, etc. We point out blind spots in their thinking, and we also introduce them to experiential interventions such as individual therapy, AA, groups, etc. And as a result, their thoughts change, and they begin to incrementally make new choices, resulting in new behaviors, yielding new experiences that generate new emotions, which reinforces their desire to seek more new information, and over time, the client's life incrementally improves until we get to the maintenance phase, which is where continued exposure to recovery information reinforces the positive changes in their lives, ultimately creating a new healthy status quo. It's my belief that information and the resultant experiences are probably the most important aspects of this change model. Understanding the application of one of the core aspects of quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, helps to resolve one of the most common, pervasive, and destructive beliefs infecting our patients: victim mentality. The false belief that their state and consequent behaviors are dictated by environmental factors, people, things, circumstances, events, etc., resulting in a word, blaming. And it's hard to blame our patients for blaming their environment for their state and their choices when everything they've learned in school about the nature of reality reinforces a cause and effect way of thinking. Conventional wisdom throughout modern history is that at our most fundamental level, we're made up of tiny marbles, right? Atoms, subatomic particles, and nothing more. This premise creates the false impression that everything merely bounces off of everything else. This model also implies that any sort of change requires significant overt effort, time, and is largely out of our control as we bounce off of our environment, which is far larger and more influential than are we. An understanding of some of the elemental aspects of quantum physics helps to undermine this dogmatic view, which is so prevalent in our patients. One dimension of quantum mechanics, which we'll explore, quantum field theory, although it's no longer a theory but the most successful model of reality we have to date, shows how we are not victims of our circumstances, but rather that we create our circumstances, and the mechanism behind how that works is going to be something that we're going to focus on. When clients can no longer blame their circumstances or anything but themselves, this forces a fundamental shift in their mindset toward recovery, toward their past, such as shame and regret, and their prospects for the future, which yields hope, and hopefully a new mindset toward spirituality. First, let's look at how an antiquated understanding of the world in our science teachers did us a supreme disservice with a simple error of how atoms have always been depicted visually. To the right, you've got a hydrogen atom, you've got your nucleus, and an electron floating around in fairly close proximity. And even if you look at the electron fields in the lower left-hand corner of that right-hand image, you can see that everything is very tightly packed. To the left, the periodic table represents atoms, those marbles with tiny electrons flying around them, the nuclei, that we imagine to be in tight formation. You'll be astounded at how out of scale the representations we've grown up with actually are, and the implications for this simple visual error.
We were all taught in school that the world is made of stuff, of matter, of mass, of atoms. Atoms make up molecules, molecules make up materials, and everything is made of that. But atoms actually are mostly empty. For example, if this ball were the nucleus of an atom, a proton in a hydrogen atom, for example, then the electron circling this, which would describe the outer limits of that atom, would be out by that mountain over there, roughly 20 miles away. And everything in between is empty. In fact, the universe is mostly empty. However, when we go down in scale, in the emptiness, we eventually come to a level, a fundamental level of space-time geometry, the fine basement level of the universe, where there's information, there's a pattern. It's called the Planck scale, and it's the fabric of the universe. And at that level, there's information that's been there since the Big Bang.
Scientists spent the last few decades studying the precise nature of all of that empty space, and the results have been astounding and profound. So let's frame this information a few different ways. If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom were blown up to the size of a golf ball, as you see here, the electron could be anywhere in a sphere within a 1.5 mile radius of the nucleus. If you removed all of the empty space from between all of the atoms comprising the concrete, glass, and steel of the IDS Tower in downtown Minneapolis, which you can see there in the background, you'd be left with something the size of a tiny grain of rice, weighing millions of tons. If you removed all of the empty space from between all of the subatomic particles making up all 7.5 billion people on the planet, you'd end up with something, a clump of matter the size of a sugar cube. You and I are barely more than holograms, yet modern medicine focuses only on the 1/10,000,000th of us that is actual matter, ignoring the other 99.9999999% of us that Eastern philosophy and placebo effect seem to leverage, which is a major focus in my practice. So let's dig down a bit more into the sub-basement level of reality, to what all that empty space is really made of, how it works, and why it's so important for us and for our patients. Remember when you were taught in school that the 3 fundamental particles in an atom are a proton, neutron, and electron? Well, the reality is that the proton and neutron are each actually comprised of 3 smaller particles, quarks, that come in 2 varieties, up quarks and down quarks. I guess by the 70s, when these things were discovered, physicists ran out of fancy names for the subatomic particles, so there you go, up quarks and down quarks. Anyway, the proton contains 2 up quarks and a down quark, and a neutron consists of 2 down quarks and an up quark. The electrons of the atom orbit the nucleus, as shown in the previous video. In most fundamental terms, however, an atom truly consists only of 3 fundamental particles, right? Up quarks, down quarks, and electrons. It's astounding if you take a moment to think about that. Everything in the universe, you, me, your chair, etc., are just slightly differing arrangement of only these 3 fundamental particles. Now, where do these particles come from, and what is the mechanism behind their appearance and their behavior? Well, these fundamental particles are derived from what lies in all of that empty space. At the sub-basement level of reality lie 17 immaterial fields, all enmeshed and interacting with each other to create what we refer to as reality, the universe, etc. It's important to understand that these immaterial fields are continuous and unbroken throughout space and time. They go throughout the entire universe, and they go all the way back to the Big Bang. So there are 3 basic types of fields. Scalar fields, which are represented to the left. Vector fields, which are the orange ones in the middle. And the Higgs field. So here they are and how they work. Scalar fields yield particles, quarks, electrons, etc. There are 12 scalar fields, but we only care about the ones that actually create the building blocks of reality. Tiny excitations, or localized little sparks of energy in the scalar field, interact with the Higgs field, which is the mechanism whereby energy is converted to matter. Remember, the fields are just immaterial energy. Once we have a particle, the vector fields govern their behavior. For instance, holding the up and down quarks together into protons and neutrons, and also holding the protons and neutrons together into nuclei, and finally governing the behavior of electrons, creating the atoms in the periodic table that we all learned about in school, and then allowing for chemistry, with the outer shell of the electrons, which helps create molecules and thus everything and everyone else in the universe. If it were not for the vector fields, particles would simply just fly around willy-nilly and nothing would coalesce into anything recognizable. The universe would be very different if any values or aspects of this intricate system differed in the least. So it is the fields, or the field system, that is ultimately fundamental in the architecture of the universe, not particles or matter. Let's have a little look at how this plays out with a two-dimensional visualization. Never mind the short ads, I can't fix that. So here we have an example of a field. They're always fluctuating. We've got the up quark, down quark, and electron field is there to the left, and they interact with the Higgs field. So the fields have these little perturbations or excitations that occur throughout the entire field. Usually, the excitations are too small in energy level to interact with the Higgs field. Each field is going to have its own excitations. And this isn't two-dimensional visualization, but it's not difficult to extrapolate what this might be like in a three-dimensional scenario. But these fields are always vibrating. They're called vacuum field fluctuations, and it's only at points where the energy levels spike up enough to interact with the Higgs field that anything actually happens, that a particle is made. In the meantime, there are virtual particles that barely have enough energy to interact with the Higgs field that are constantly almost being made. That's why they're called virtual particles. And this is going to be important a little bit later on. These virtual particles, again, they appear, but then they get immediately annihilated and that energy is returned back to the field. These virtual particles don't create any real particles, again, because they don't meet the energy requirements to interact with the Higgs field. However, when they do, suddenly we have matter. A particle appears, and we have an electron or a quark or some other field. So we have basically two states, right, in the universe. The immaterial fields, and these words can be interchanged, whether it's immaterial or fields or waves or energy and information, which is also immaterial, right? It doesn't have mass. And then the second state of being would be matter or particles or anything with mass that we would consider to be solid. Those are the two states of existence in the universe. But again, the field system is fundamental to all of material reality. So now I'd like to introduce the idea of consciousness. And where does that fit into the picture? Remember those virtual particles whose energy level was just below that which would be sufficient to interact with the Higgs field, creating a particle? Well, it's that phenomenon which makes it so that the application of just slightly more energy can push those virtual particles into a state where they have enough energy to interact with the Higgs field. And consciousness is simply energy with intent. This is how mind over matter becomes quite a literal expression. It was a famous lab experiment decades ago called the double slit experiment, by which scientists stumbled upon the inextricable relationship between consciousness and material reality. So let's have a look at the double slit experiment.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never-world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Okay. So the state of the unobserved or unmeasured system is undefined. He talked about that as being superposition. It's in wave form. The reason physicists initially had trouble figuring out how their observation of the system, or lack thereof, could have an impact on its state was because the physicists incorrectly imagined themselves as being separate from the apparatus. In other words, they failed to understand at the time that both they and the apparatus are in fact derivative of the exact same field system. Measurement or observation requires an observer with awareness, consciousness, if you will. And in the absence of an observer, no particles are formed, leaving nothing but potential. You might say, well, that's all fine and dandy when we're talking about a single subatomic particle in a lab, but we're not in a lab. There are no slits in the world, which is much more complex than a lab apparatus. You wouldn't be the first to have thought of that, so let's have a look at how that plays out.
You might know Harbor Freight for affordability. What you might not know, performance and durability go.
Velocity is unknowable, but unmeasured properties are not just uncertain, they are fundamentally undefined. One of the most profound illustrations of this is the famous double slit experiment. If you aren't familiar, check out our previous episode that discusses it in detail. You might also want to catch up on the first two in our quantum field theory playlist, because we are going to be building on that. But the too long didn't watch for the double slit experiment is this. A particle, say a photon or an electron, travels through a barrier containing two slits to a screen. Its initial and final positions are known, but what path does it take in between? Which slit does it go through? The interference pattern produced by particles on the screen can only be explained if each of them travels through both slits, not as a particle, but as a wave that fills the intervening space, interacts with itself, and defines the probability of that particle actually showing up at a given point on the screen. There's a story about a quantum mechanics professor explaining the double slit experiment to a class. The prof showed how the locations of the particles on the screen can be calculated by adding the amplitude of a wave passing through one slit to the amplitude of a wave passing through the other slit. One impertinent student asked, "What happens if you cut a third slit in the barrier?" The professor replied, "Obviously you have to add together the amplitudes of waves passing through all three slits." The student pushed it. "But what if you add 4 slits? What about 5? To which the agitated professor repeated, "Add the amplitudes of 4 slits, 5 slits, etc. Feeling cocky, the student asked, "What about if you cut infinite slits, so there's no more screen? And then what if you add a second screen with infinite slits?" As the probably apocryphal story goes, that student was Richard Feynman, and he just outlined the basics of what was to become the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. It was a simple idea, but it led to the most elegant formulation of quantum mechanics ever devised, and became a key to quantum field theory. That in turn has provided us with our clearest understanding of the fundamental structure of the subatomic world.
Okay, so the old model of reality, which operated through the end of the last century, was useful to a great degree, but it does not explain nearly as much as the new model, which incorporates quantum field theory and consciousness. Consciousness, again, energy with intent, is a field unique to each of us. I like to think of it as the ghost in the machine. Others might call it our soul, but the dynamics are all the same regardless. Now, I'd like to touch for a minute on the idea of information. Information in the most fundamental sense of the word underlies everything, including the unified field system we've been exploring thus far. The rules by which the field system operates are defined somehow by information, right? Information on our plane of existence requires a medium by which to propagate. Do you remember the Dispenza change model discussed earlier? New information leads to new thoughts, etc. Well, I'd like to refer you to Chapter 11 handout that I'm provided. It's in my book. If you don't have the book, you can listen. Just for fun, if it's helpful, think of yourself as the person on the right of the screen as I'm reading, and think of me as being on the left. Here we go. Consider for a moment the letters that make up the words on the pages of this book. The letters are actually made up of microscopic dots of ink molecules sprayed onto the pages of paper that is composed of paper molecules, all of which are composed of atoms that, in turn, consist of subatomic particles, quarks and electrons. Each subatomic particle is derivative of perturbations in one of the three respective fields from which everything we see originates. The letters, the words, sentences, and ink on the page are being perceived by your brain. Your brain is derivative of the same subatomic particles and field perturbations as the content and media comprising this book. The neurons that synthesize the ideas contained herein, those in my mind or brain, are derivative of the selfsame fields that comprise you, the book, the ink, etc. This is a closed system consisting of author, which is me, content or information, media, the paper or computer by which the information is conveyed, and reader, you, all of which are derivative of the same continuous fields. Given this, one could ask, why not just leave out the middleman? Why is a book even needed? This information was always present within the field, so why don't I just know all this stuff like the author does? To put it in more scientific terms, the fields need not have organized themselves into subatomic particles comprising the neurons in my brain, which all fired in such a manner that I ultimately came up with the content of this book. Remember, my brain and its neurons are derivative of the exact same fields that your brain is. Throughout the entire author, content, reader system, the quantum fields are the common denominator permeating the subjective reader, which is you, the subjective author, which is me, and the objective media by which this information is being conveyed from my brain to yours. The medium through which this information is transmitted is derivative of the same fields as the source and receiver of the information, whether via electronic screen, by paper, or by voice through the air, which is also derivative of, you guessed it, the quantum fields. We are all inextricably connected by the fields of and through which we and everything in the universe exists. They're continuous, indivisible, and are the fundamental element upon which all of reality is built. I would suggest that all information in the universe is already baked into the unified field system. One conclusion that seems plausible as a result of this thought exercise is that our physical state as human beings is a limiting factor in our ability to access all the information that is available in the universe. What if we were no longer constrained by our physical being, existing only as an immaterial state of awareness? When we die, do we simply get absorbed back into the entire field system? Are we separate from the field system in that state of pure awareness? Or is separation an illusion perpetuated by our current perceptive abilities? And what would be the impact on our patients if they were able to incorporate this information into their worldview? Information transfer need not only be between people or sentient beings. Consciousness has a material impact on our environment, as we shall see momentarily.
Mr. Emoto became terribly interested in the molecular structure of water and what affects it. Now, water is the most receptive of the four elements. Mr. Emoto thought perhaps it would respond to non-physical events. So he set up a series of studies applied mental stimuli and photographed it with a dark field microscope. This first picture is a picture of water from the Fujiwara Dam. And this picture is the same water after receiving a blessing from a Zen Buddhist monk. Now, in this next series of pictures, Mr. Emoto printed out words, taped them to bottles of distilled water, and left them out overnight. This first photograph is a picture of the pure distilled water, just the essence of itself. These subsequent photographs, as you can see, are each different. This is the chi of love. And we move along here to thank you. And you can see where he taped that to this bottle here. But if you read Japanese, you already knew that. Now, Mr. Emoto speaks of the thought or intent being the driving force in all of this. The science of how that actually affects the molecules is unknown, except to the water molecules, of course. And it's really fascinating when you keep in mind that 90% of our bodies are water.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
So remember, neurons are made of molecules, right? And those molecules are made from atoms, which are made from quarks and electrons, all of which are derivative of the quantum field system, which is ultimately defined by information. So let's talk for a minute about cognitive restructuring, right?
Synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this is what's happening in your brain, geniuses. If you learned one bit of information today, your brain did this. Boom. That's learning. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment. Every time you learn something in your brain, there's a physical change that takes place, and learning is making new connections. Are you with me? This is how fast it happens, too. That's learning. If you learn anything this week, you've made a footprint. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then if you keep firing the same thoughts over and over again, you're going to wire them in your brain. So then if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. And all of a sudden, they develop a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more you communicate, the more they connect. And neurons are exactly the same way. Now, as you begin to learn information, neurons tend to assemble themselves into networks, or what's called neural networks. And neural networks are just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections that's related to a thought, a skill, a habit, a behavior, a concept. And neural networks are automatic programs. You have a neural network to brush your teeth, to put on makeup, to speak a language, to walk. All of a sudden, those neurons then form a hardware circuitry, but if you keep repeating it, the hardware becomes a software program and it becomes automatic. So then, you want to see a thought? Watch. Boom, there's a thought. Right there. Watch again. Boom, that's a thought. You generate more electrical impulses in your brain in one day than all the cell phones on the planet put together. And it's not coming from the candy bar you just ate. You are connected to a greater field.
So that's what cognitive restructuring is. It also happens to be what has been occurring the entire time that you've been sitting in this presentation, both as the information has been flowing from me to you, but also as your own consciousness has been working out some of the implications for this new information, either consciously or unconsciously. So what are some of the implications of this idea that we cause and effect rather than the old cause and effect model that we grew up with? For our clients, well, with this new information, we're able to change our patient's point of view from victim to creator of their own destiny. So this increased sense of control decreases anxiety, right? It also, I guess, emphasizes the importance of thinking about what we're thinking about, because if we get what we're thinking about, then it makes sense to start thinking about what we're thinking about so we don't get what we don't want. It also enables patients to reframe their history in terms of, blaming their past for, or their shame or their trauma on events, when they realize that they probably played a certain role in creating those events and having those people in their lives who reacted so well to how they perceived the world. This point of view instills hope for the future, because once we start defining what we truly want and causing that to come into reality, we start getting addicted to that idea, and it takes on a life of its own, creating a lot of hope for our patient's future. Quantum field theory allows us to feel connected to other people, right? If we're simply extensions of the same field system, we are really no different from them. It gives us a sense of connection to others and potentially to a higher power. That's not illogical to draw those conclusions. The science is irrefutable, and something that's useful from a spiritual perspective about this point of view is that we're able to bypass the righting reflex, the tendency for patients to push back against being told, what the conditions are for engaging in any sort of spirituality. They're completely in charge of generating their reality. So, again, this change model is very useful, especially when our patients understand some of the basic aspects of quantum physics. They can't possibly ever really be the same again, to the extent that they're able to internalize them. Some questions that can help further elicit spirituality, once this information has been covered, is, do subatomic particles aspire? Do they want things? Do they love? Again, this is all pushback against the old way of thinking. What is information, and is the quantum field an algorithm, or is there some active participation by a higher power with it? Could the information have come from somewhere or someone? And if energy can't be destroyed, what does that mean for us in terms of framing our current adversity in the big picture? Is it really going to matter in the long run? One question is, does our essence, our spiritual nature, that ghost in the machine, have any pathology? I would argue probably not. I'm going to run through these fundamental principles because of time constraints, and we can discuss them. I'm happy to stick around, or I can be reached by internet or phone using my contact information at the end of the presentation. But I want to go through these principles that have been derived from my experience in dealing with quantum field theory and QBERT itself. Number one, the universe is indifferent, responding to our aspirations. When we have mixed feelings, we're going to get mixed results. We ourselves and everything around us are expressions of the same unified field. The unified field is the mechanism by which we both commune with and receive feedback from the field system, from the universe. All conscious beings are connected through the field. In an unobserved state, the unified field represents infinite possibilities at every single point in time. We each author our own realities, either consciously or unconsciously, or both. selecting from an infinite number of possibilities at every moment in time. The greater the specificity, emotional content, and persistence of our conscious vision, what we want, the more specific and voluminous will be the universe's response. Our aspirations are future memories corresponding to an idealized state of being that exists in one potential reality, serving as a beacon toward which we may be drawn or toward which we may direct our energies. We're no longer depending on our past to project into the future, but it's as a forward-looking model. The universe wants us to be happy, wanting us to walk in a reality akin to our own definition of heaven on earth, where gratitude is the predominant emotion and in which our potential is fully realized. This is an Eastern philosophy. And finally, living in our most authentic state in the present affords us the best opportunity to occupy the reality to which we aspire, compressing the time between now and then. If we have mixed feelings or pathology or other thinking errors interfering with our ability to be authentic, the universe, we're going to get mixed results. So a clinician pondering the implementation of QBERT with their patients might say, wow, this is great, but gosh, it would take forever for someone to internalize and begin applying these concepts in their life. Unfortunately, you've all already been fully applying these concepts to your entire life. You just haven't been aware of it. Think about it. Reason this with me. Right now, for better or for worse, your life represents the cumulative effect of every thought you've ever had. Your entire life as you sit here exemplifies quantum field theory in action. Every conscious or subconscious doubt that you've ever had about what's either possible or impossible for you has informed your choices, your behaviors, your experiences, and emotions running in a circular fashion, yielding the life that you have now, and this will continue. You can see how gaining new information along the way has also worked to your benefit. We need not, like our patients, be facing jail time, the abandonment of loved ones, or existential despair in order to realize that our thoughts and unquestioned beliefs have likely limited us or created a gap between where we are now and where we intuitively believe that we could be in terms of things like our professional advancement, our finances, our relationships, our physical aspirations, or our overall happiness. So these concepts not only dictate our patients' well-being and their futures, but our own as well. I told you at the beginning of this presentation that this is also an experiential intervention. So more of this information and 36 hours worth of corresponding media are available in my book, Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery, of which I have a few copies here, or which are available from Amazon. I offer in-person and remote presentations such as this one for lunch and learns, as well as clinical track curriculum for individuals, facilities, and group practices. I offer in-person 2 or 3 day workshops with clinical group notes, templates of those notes to treatment facilities, workshops that can be done over a weekend if necessary to unburden clinical staff for other opportunities. And finally, I do have a workbook to facilitate patient personalization of this QBERT model within a group or an individual setting. I thank you for your time and look forward to any questions you have, again, whether by phone or by email or in person. Thank you very much for your time.